continue. Yeah, and we will go to a new share. I'll stop displaying my advert. This is an interesting slideshow to look at, and I use it as a jumping off point really to talk about various different things and to draw together on some of the themes that we have talked about thus far, and to give perhaps some more solid examples and visualizations of manifestations of the principles that we're talking about. So I have a good friend, a permaculture mentor. His name is Chris Dixon. He lives a small place called Tir Penrhos Isaf, which is in the Coed Brennan, in the King's Forest, north of Dolgellau, so right in the heart of Snowdonia. And his dream, his great thing, I don't know, certainly predated Chicken Shack by a good few years, so maybe 25, so 30 years plus years ago, he bought a little piece of land surrounded by Coed Brennan forest, overgrazed sheep desert, and his ambition was to nurse that back into biodiversity and to observe the process. It was his own education. Chris is a real observer of nature, and in many ways he really has taught me a lot and inspired me a lot, and the lessons that he taught me still inspired me, if you like, to be better, to pay more attention, to keep notes, to be more methodical. And on his first years on his piece of land, Chris would do the same walk every day and just observe what was happening. He said he'd get down on his hands and knees and part the grass and just look to see what plants were coming up, what could he identify. And a lot of what he observed in those early years was he had a piece of land that had been almost permanently grazed, who knows, for decades and decades, hundreds of years possibly. And by excluding grazing animals from a part of it, now he and his partner have, she trains horses, so she's a behavioral therapist who works with horses. But by excluding grazing animals from a big part of the land and just observing what happened, sort of Chris created this really wonderful learning journey. And I visited his place many, many times with PDCs over the years. And so every year or two, I'd come up with the group again and get the next chapter, the next layer of observations. And it's kind of fascinating, but also interesting that a function of Chris's character maybe is he would give almost exactly the same presentation every time, the same chain of thought, the same chain of logic, the same observations, and what had led him to draw conclusions, and then how he'd tested that idea, and then what that taught him. It's very logical like that. But every time I'd come, there was always another chapter, another bit on the end. So I'd always sort of breathlessly waiting to get to the new bit of the story. It's like having to hear the whole of Lord of the Rings, or Lord of the Rings, before you get to hear the add-on 20 minutes or something. Anyway, that's Chris. He has interesting website, which I'll have to find the link for you. Again, just stuff he's documented over the years. A lot of the stuff that I say about gorse, I learned from Chris Dixon, amongst other things. This is mountains in North Wales. Here we see a bare mountain top, mainly rock sticking out. I'm not sure what that is there, and then we see Western hemlock. This is monoculture of non-native trees, planted single monocrop. A single monocrop for the purposes of making money, with no consideration of how that sits within the landscape. No consideration of how that affects sort of drainage or pathways for wildlife. It's just kind of imposed on the landscape. And there's a lot of that here, of kind of, because there's big holdings of land and people just have a single idea of what to do on it. And that has really vast implications, really. I'm sure you know the journalist George Monbiot. He he trained as a zoologist actually originally, and is yeah, I mean, a kind of interesting guy. Some of his journalism is a bit annoying because he has to be controversial to get, you know, clickbait kind of creating. But I think he's got some very interesting things to say, and he wrote a book a few years ago called Feral, and it's about rewilding, and it's also well, whilst he was living in Wales, he used to live in Machynlleth. A friend of mine used to work for him, sort of part of the wider Centre for Alternative Technology world for a bit. He's got very deep green sensibilities and a really good understanding, let's say, of ecology. I really recommend that book to read. And in that book, he documents really how the degree to which the Welsh landscape has become a kind of hollowed out shell of an what used to be diversity. And really it's the impact of these kind of monocultural systems that do have a really terrible long-term impact. So we've got to move away from that, and we see quite a lot of that in Wales. Anyway, this is the Dolgellau side of Cadair Idris. I think it's, as they call, Fox's Path. I think it comes up this very, very steep approach from this side, and big lump of really tough rock from an old volcano or something, and it would have been glaciated 10,000 years ago, and then obviously those glaciers melted, huge amounts of the ice and then rocks and boulders and weathering and erosion would have happened and deposited soils much further down in the valley, and those sort of soils accumulate organic matter, and we have sort of fertility and farming lower down. This is like the source, if you like, and you can think about that, and we can see, you know, little bits of regeneration, and looks like grasses and things slowly establishing on these scree slopes, typical Welsh scene. And so Chris tells a story about this landscape and about how obviously the action of water and weathering, expanding and contracting, creating fissures in the rocks, you know, is the feeding ground to create new soils. And he tells a story about how in the 1980s there were lots of employment creation schemes, youth community program, youth servicey, work experience kind of things, and in part was a slightly sinister, cynical tactic by the Tory government to mask unemployment figures. So lots of kind of half thought through kind of half jobs were created to kind of, you know, for those kind of purposes. And so they sent lots of teams up to all over Cadair Idris of people to fix the footpaths. It's a very popular hill walking area, big part of Welsh tourism. All that footfall creates erosion. And once you get, if you like, if you be very careful in mountain areas, because so you've got a path that's going down, straight down a hill, water's going to just torrent down that and cause problems. Okay, and also, you know, whatever, make it easy for people, safe for people to move around. So this is the story, is that there's a path up here on the top somewhere, and there is a peat bog, just like we talked about in the lesson this morning. Water gets trapped on the top of impermeable rock, so you get kinds of grasses that grow that sit on top of that and don't decompose, so it's kind of muddy. But also peat bogs can catch and hold quite a lot of water. But when you walk through this peat bog with your nice Helly Hansen walking boots, they get muddy. So that would be a shame, wouldn't it? So what they did was they excavated one of this peat bog and they put a pipe there. So instead of, when the water flowed, if there was an excess of water coming off high up the mountain, instead of that flooding the peat bog and making it all nasty, it ejected the water out of the pipe and squirted it, you know, sort of away, keep the place nice and tidy. Okay, so of course, guess what happens? Significant rain event happens. A lot of water, a lot more than they'd originally planned for, of water comes off down the hill, squirting through this pipe. So if you have a pipe pointing down a hill that's got a jet of water coming out of it, what's going to happen? You're going to cause a massive amount of erosion. So try and retain this image in your mind's eye, and we go to the next one. And after one rainfall, this mountainside changed from that to that, there's an enormous amount of material has fallen down. Huge point down, huge landslide came all the way down here. All of this is new. And Chris just thought, well, that's an interesting observation, isn't it? In terms of minimum input, maximum effect. Now, that might not have been the desired effect, but it's telling us something, isn't it? There's something to be learned about that. You can make one small change in exactly the right point of a system, the weakest point of a system, and the whole thing changes. Interesting, fascinating. Gravity, water, landscape, these things combined together, they're very, very powerful forces. So when we're playing with water, when we're playing with landscapes, we really do need to pay attention. This is way too steep a slope to be working on. That's why we work on these lower, you know, the convex, concave. So we'll be working on the lower slopes to trap water and build ecosystems, because at these higher slopes, you know, that's a lot of erosive power. Another wonderful, nice thing that happens, of course, in forestry is they clear fell it. So when they do come and fell it, they take the whole lot and leave the sort of stumps and things sort of to be bleached by the sun. What soils have built up underneath then are suddenly shocked by being exposed to the sun. So there'll be a lot of carbon released from that soil. No attempt to sequestrate any of this material or do anything useful or valuable with it. Like turning it into biochar, and instead just leaving the landscape in shock. This, it's a little bit hard to see that the white thing is a dog there turning around. What you're seeing there is a tractor track, and the thing that does the clear felling is a big tractor machine that can go straight up the hill, and it's got a big saw on the front and a grab, so it holds the tree, slices it off. Then it runs it through a thing that takes off all the side branches. The log goes back and all the side branches go to the side and up it goes up the hill. So it's actually excavating a trench directly up and down the hill. So again, when it rains, enormous amounts of water and soil and mud and potentially useful material washes down. And these photos are from, I don't know, 20 years ago. I was driving through the Welsh Hills only last month and I saw them still doing exactly this. This is because, of course, what happens is gravity, water, soil ends up, it ends up at the bottom of the hill, not in the fields. And wherever you look, you're realizing when you see all these muddy puddles, you're seeing the most valuable resource of all leaving the system, blocking drains. There it is, quality topsoil. And now it's a problem. You know, resources in the wrong place can cause problems. This is the Mawddach estuary. This is the Mawddach River, has Barmouth down there and Arthog over there. And look, they're desperately trying to drain these wetlands down here and so that they can farm them. They can get a bit more farming, essentially in the soils have already washed out of the system. So really, I guess our permaculture mindset will be going is, look, here we're trying to resolve the symptom of a problem. And no matter how clever we are in terms of farming down here in the wetland, it would have been a whole lot better. Our main priority would be to keep that soil up in the mountains where we can use it. So again, this is really, going after the symptom rather than the problem and really failing to resolve the issue. But you know, this is our world, isn't it? Okay, so we talked about water. So this is again thinking of the river of life. There is a river in its senescence, in its old, it's dropping its silts, it's slowing down, meandering, heading off to sea. Here's a young stream. Here's a mountain stream. Now, it's interesting is to consider is that the average speed of a stream and a river is the same, whether in the hills, in the top, in the middle, or in the bottom. Eventually, it's all one system flowing through. And you look at this and you go, well, that can't be true, because that mountain stream is definitely a whole lot faster than that sort of estuarine river. Well, to a certain extent, that's correct. There's definitely parts of this where it's accelerating very fast. If you throw, I don't know, a rubber duck in there, or I don't know, some ping pong balls, what you'll see is that they'll eddy around, and there'll be places where they get caught, and they sort of get caught for a moment and bounce around, and they'll do this sort of interesting journey. They don't go straight down the track. It's because there's so many things to deflect the water as it's coming down here. It's bouncing off things, and it starts to corkscrew. So they think there's kind of a sense that the journey that water's making as it's traveling down is sort of has a shape, and you can imagine it's kind of corkscrews, and that's partly because it's bouncing off of things, but also the earth's turning. There's a certain momentum to everything, and so it's responding. Again, thinking about pattern formation, there is pattern formation in water. Now I'm going to mention the name. I'll put some links in the notes, and I might put another video in. I'll mention the name of a guy, interesting guy called Victor Shauberger. And now, when I came across this on my first PDC in '95, it was a bit too far out there for me. I'm quite, I like to hold on to the rational, scientific, observable, testable stuff. When it gets a bit too woo-woo out there, a bit witchy, I'm a bit like, I'm not so sure, not that I've got closed mind, but I'm a little bit, reserved about that. So some of the Shauberger stuff seemed a little bit out there for me, reading the book and stuff. But it's not gone away, and it's made me keep coming back and revisiting some of the concepts within that. And we'll chat about that a little bit. But what's very interesting is that his children, his descendants, I don't know if they're children, grandchildren, he was there, I think, he was a forest ranger. He worked in the forestry in Austria, Bavaria, that sort of place, in the interwar period. His career was affected by the war, probably. And over that time, he went from being a park ranger and a naturalist, someone who was, deep in the unspoilt Bavarian Tyrol forests. And then he somehow became a kind of a systems engineer and helped design log flumes, constructed, what would you call them, a flume, I guess a channel, constructed channel that has a flow of water in it that they would then use to log the forests and to make them transport, get them out of the mountains, the big trees, and float them down to the rivers and then float them off to the sawmills. So ironically, he helped kind of destroy the forest that he loved. But anyway, but in the process of all of that, so the book is called Living Water. His book is called Living Water, and he gets really deep about water. And I think there's a massive area of investigation there to be had. So the thing that I wanted to add was that, so his children and grandchildren, who are now contemporaries to us now, let's say, have started a Shauberger Research Institute, academic foundation, scientific research foundation in Austria, and they're now trying to replicate some of his ideas, and they're having a lot of success with that. And now with modern tools, they can now start to measure and describe scientifically things that he could only use, describe, let's say anecdotally, back in, let's say, the 30s or whenever it was he was doing his main research. So ideas that Shauberger brings forward are: water has structure, water has shape, it has memory, it has age. It's not a universal thing. I think we explored that idea a bit when we thought about how the rainfall and the evaporation of moisture spirals and enters a landscape. It's interacting with all those plants, it's picking up biological information and particles and minerals and all sorts. So it's changing in nature. Rainfall, I believe they say it's not good to drink rainwater because it hasn't yet been energized. So anyway, let's not get too far into that whole thing. So as I say, it's a little bit woo out there, but let's stay with it. Let's stay close to the side of the pool, right? And water's essentially, in some ways, the water isn't just coming straight down here, it's circulating, it's spiraling. And that spiral shape is part of what keeps it in the channel. It's really energizing in itself, okay? The next thing that it's doing as it's spiraling down the channel is it's foaming. It's literally folding air into the water. It's oxygenating itself. It's absolutely energizing the water with oxygen. So now that what had been rainwater, now this has been completely transformed because it's having this movement, this shaping, this mixing it up, and this aeration. It's interacting with the soils and the gravels in the stream, which is also cleaning it and filtering it. So it's having this sort of this really dynamic process. Okay, so there's like our little mountain stream, and I think about that a little bit. That's kind of interesting. Is there anything else I want to say there? Well, I could say a bit more about the Shauberger thing, but I have a question. Yes, it might be shallower. Michelle is just saying the young upland river is narrower and deeper. It's not necessarily so deep, but it's narrow and energized. Yeah, I guess in terms of the shape of the channel. Okay, we'll stay with that because there's another big point I want to get to, but I could talk about the trout turbine. I'll just say one more thing about Shauberger, and perhaps to try and whet your appetite to look into the video, or in fact the book Living Water, which is quite amazing. But observation that Shauberger made is he's looking over the bridge into the river on a nice sunny day, and there's dappled shade from the trees and whatever, and there's a big trout in the river. And the river's fairly fast flowing, and the trout is just sat there in the flow of the river with its nose pointed uphill, and it's not moving. So his question was, why isn't it being washed backwards? What is it about the shape of the trout and the flow of the water that there's the head of the trout, there's the fast flowing water. The trout isn't flicking its tail, it's literally sitting there. And he starts to realize that as the water breaks around the head of the trout, it creates an eddy, which actually flows all the way around until it creates a sort of a backflow against itself. And the skin of the fish is very smooth in one direction, but it's almost like sandpaper in the other. So somehow the fish can grip the water. And he started to think about the shape of eddies, the flows within the water, the shapes that are created when you disturb the water flow, and then how you can then use that to accelerate propulsion or to move things in a particular direction. So the next observation he made was, if you drop a stone in the river or whatever, distress the trout, it flicks its tail and it shoots up against the flow of the river. Well, if you wanted to make a quick exit, you quite possibly would go with the flow of the river. Anyway, I just wanted to whet your appetite. That's some kind of interesting thoughts there. Hi Lydia. We're just chatting about water again, and then putting it into a context. We're up in Dolgethlau in Coed-y-Brenin up there, and looking at how the forests are and the forestry. Hi, and thinking about erosion and that soils are originating from the mountains, eroding, and the action of water, bringing those particles downhill. And that's kind of a continuous process. The national parks people made a mistake, and they put a little pipe to drain an area some years ago, and just that one action caused an enormous amount of material to flow down from the mountain. And that was a mistake. They didn't mean to do that. But Chris Dixon, who slides these are, a permaculture mentor, friend of mine, he was sort of musing about finding that tipping point where you could do the minimum input that creates a maximum effect. And I think there's a cautionary story there about working in mountains and understanding how if we work on very steep slopes, it's potentially very dangerous. So we're talking about soil erosion, and we got back to talking about water and rivers. And I just name-checked a guy called Victor Shauberger, who was a guy between the wars in the 30s and 40s who made some very, very interesting observations about the shape and structure and dynamics of water. and he created very elaborate systems to float trees down rivers, to stop flooding, and to keep the water in the channel of the river by giving it back its shape. All of this is now being explored at this Shauberger Institute. There's a great video that introduces you to that. So I'm going to stop that line of thinking just there, but let's say pause it. We can talk about it later. Okay, so back to the action of water in landscapes and rivers and stuff like that. And I also was saying in this mountain stream, thinking about how the water is energized and aerated and circulated and go through the sands and the gravels and so forth. So this water is being cleaned and energized. Every now and again, we might get a very heavy rainfall, and that heavy rainfall might bring with it all sorts of detritus. Maybe there's been a storm and some trees are down, branches are down, you know, whatever. There's always going to be materials. There's always materials moving through systems. Think of this like a conveyor belt of materials. Don't forget that image that he gave you in Morocco of where they sort of saw the river as a builder's market, you know, just going past their house, their communities. So look, this river has been in spate. A torrent has come crashing down the hillside. It's brought with us a whole bunch of branches and what have you, and they've log jammed across there. Look, there's some young saplings they've caught. So then what happens is the water that's coming behind is hitting those logs and it's depositing. It can't carry now the gravels, the shingle, the sand, the silts that spate of water has washed down. So it starts to deposit behind it. So over time, this might silt up and become a little wetland. The river would get wider, so we'd have a little sort of a wet patch, a wider patch. It would get a bit deeper and a bit muddy maybe, and then it would sort of fill up to the top and then flow over. And so think again about how the shape of the river over time might sort of wax and wane and change, but in the process, build wetlands. In the process, slow the flow of water in certain ways. And when we slow the flow of water, it deposits. It's just like it's in the rule book, you know, you can't carry as much stuff if you're going slower. You've lost the kinetic energy, the forward motion that's carrying the silt. So in the same way as we saw deposition in the Mouthach Valley, we're going to see deposition here behind this natural obstacle. So rivers dam themselves, self-damming rivers. File that under interesting, and we'll come back to that as an idea, because we're interested. Remember what we talked about this morning is we're interested in how do we trap more water in landscapes. The way you stop flooding is you reduce the flow, you slow it down. You don't speed it up with drainage channels and stuff. You actually slow it down. So how would you do that? What are easy ways to slow water down? You know, so you might think, well, that's kind of a rare occurrence and it's a bit messy as well. Michelle gets a prize. You just stole what I was going to say. Yes, beavers. Actually, this is only replicating what is an action which is also, you know, caused by beavers. And beavers are habitat engineers, because if they build a leaky dam, it seals itself up behind the silts and things, and they create a pond. Now that you've got an area of still water that's slightly deeper and broader, so then in can come other species. It creates habitat opportunities, new ecological niches. Then the whole living system has the opportunity to diversify. And also by slowing down and catching that water, we've now increased the potential of that system to support more life, because water is nearly always the limiting factor. Don't forget, if you do farming in water, if you do like fish farming and integrated fish farming, you can have 10 times as much of productivity as you can on land. There's a whole chapter in Bill Wollaston's design book just dedicated to farming in water, because it's a whole habitat of its own. So we'll come back to that. But think again, habitat engineers, species that create opportunities for other species, that build diversity. we need to be that too. So we can learn a lot by looking at the actions of the beavers and other similar kind of systems engineers. Very, very important. And of course, now we're seeing the slow and slightly tentative reintroduction of beavers back into the landscapes. And we need it. And we need it maybe higher up in the landscape, so that we can begin to trap and hold much, much more water higher in the hills, and then create the ability to average out the peaks and troughs of floods and droughts. You know, we're in now, I know we're over a degree of climate change. We're already seeing now really energized weather systems. We're seeing extremes at both ends. We have to build resilient landscapes. And not only can we learn from nature itself how to do that, but also we realize that there are, animals and things that we can, systems engineers that we can work with. Okay, next observation. I told you Chris was a good observer. One of the things that Chris said is, you want to observe your land, or the land, whatever it is, the place that you're trying to understand. You want to observe that at its extremes. So it's very, very valuable to see it on a really, really cold morning and watch the hoarfrost slowly melt, slowly thaw. You can see where the cold pockets are. You can see where the, the areas which perhaps are slightly warmer. You start to see the microclimates kind of mapped out for you. Hot and hot and dry. You want to see how it can handle that. But you especially want to see how your landscapes handles it when it's wet. You want to see it when it's really, everything's soaked and then it rains. That's very, very important, because again, seeing it at an extreme, and you might expose some of its vulnerabilities, or get certain insight of things that you might, need to initiate some long-term systems planning to, to remediate things, or to prepare yourself for increasingly severe events. Anyway, this is a hose pipe. I think you could work that out. And it's just across a drive. The drive is not sealed. It's not impervious. It's, and the hose pipe is just lying on the ground. Again, it's not sealed. So all that's happening here is the water is arriving slightly quicker than it's leaving. So this is a leaky dam. This is the same effect as what we're seeing here. This dam doesn't have a liner. It's not made out of concrete. No one's kind of sealed it with puddled clay. It's just nature's just thrown a load of trash there. And it works because the water is arriving faster than it's leaving. So here, this is what's happening. So when you're trapping water in a landscape, you don't necessarily need a big butyl liner. You don't necessarily need to build a dam. All you actually need to do is compact the soil a bit. And you can put a barrier, but you can compact the soil, which is what happens on a driveway. So then it's hard for the water to penetrate, especially when the soil underneath it is already saturated. Same effect in some ways that we saw in the soil water experiment. When the soil's wet, it can't take any more. It kind of becomes waterproof. Well, when we're making small ponds and dams, that can be a useful thing. So this gave some insight to Chris about the nature of how water gets trapped in landscapes. That's it. This is on Chris's land, Tir Penros Isaf, Coed y Brenin. This is Coed y Brenin. This is the big forest. And as I say, it was a sheep pasture, a sheep desert. He really felt it lost all its diversity. And one of the things he really wanted to do was to bring that back. He also wanted to sort of subdivide the landscape, so make it more interesting, more diverse. He wanted to bring in many, many more types of yields and many different types of functions. As you can see from these electric fences and so forth, is Lynn, Chris's partner, is an animal behavioral therapist, and she works with horses. And so a part of their landscape, it's about 7 or 8 acres or something, is specifically designed for horses. So one of the things about horses is you don't want them running up and downhill. They don't particularly like it, and it's difficult for them to stop. It's much better for them to run across on contour. So the idea here was to create a new field boundary that was very, very close to being on contour, and it would be planted with a hedge. We then create a field boundary that the horses then essentially would reinforce that the shape, if you like, the swale effect of this with their own hooves, because they're more likely then to come this way and go back and cross the landscape up and down. So a small thought about an observation of horse behavior and observation of water behavior. So this was designed as a swale, but actually technically it's not a swale, it's a watering ditch. Chris did some research. He's a Welsh speaker. He called it, and in Welsh he calls it a fosdyfri, a watering ditch. So it has a fall of 1 in 200. So in 200 feet, it falls 1 foot. That's enough to send surplus water when the ditch is full. Surplus water comes this way, slowly, slowly, slowly downhill, but not at such a speed that it will accelerate or begin to erode or carry soil. That's the key consideration. There's a lot of water. This is already a wetland feeding a stream that goes down here onto the right-hand side. So he felt there was a surplus of water at this end of the property, and this swale trench is going towards where his veg garden is. And I think also he had a little header tank pond for hydro thing. So it's taking surplus of water from one side of the site and delivering it where it's more useful, where it can support growing and more intensive growing systems closer to the house. So that was the rationale behind that. And the idea then was to plant it up with same view. This is now a wildlife corridor, field boundary, fodder hedge for horses. So there's the one field on the right, and now the other field is up above, obviously this side. The swale's probably disappeared now, but it's kind of done its job. And the trees effectively are the barrier that slows down the movement of water, increases infiltration, and then stops the sort of flooding lower down on the land. It's trapping the water ever so subtly higher up in the system, and also using that water to nourish a living system. And that living system performs multiple functions because this is permaculture. Multiple functions are, I already said, it's a wildlife corridor, it's a field boundary, it's trees, it's product, it's biomass, and also there's a kind of a water management function stacked in there too. And it's also helping shape the land to keep horses walking on contour. So smart system. So also have the opportunity now, because there's lots of light, it's a long thin corridor, is we can lop branches, we can coppice sections, we can harvest it in quite a casual fashion. Here is some ash poles, and they've just been harvested, tied up on the fence, obviously, and there's the horse enjoying them. And we may forget that horses are grazer browsers, as are cows. They eat graze, they eat quite a lot of pasture of grass and herbs, but they're also very happy to browse on shrubs and on trees. And certain trees they absolutely love: ash, I think hazel, willow, lime. There's many that are very, very nutritious, and they perform many other functions in a living system. Look how Lynn has got the horse also stood on a piece of board or something to reduce the effect of its poaching the ground. If horses are standing in the same place a lot, they damage the ground. Horses' survival mechanism, the way that they look after themselves in the wild is they run away. Horses are highly mobile, so they're not really designed to be in the same place a lot of the time. They get reinfected by their own worms and stuff like that. But anyway, so she's minimizing that effect. I always remember Lynn saying this once on a visit to their farm, that the place where you keep your animals, where you corral them in the evening close to the house, we call that a paddock. A paddock. A plant that you generally see a lot of in paddocks is the dock. A paddock, the dock plant. dot plant is triggered to germinate when it's in compacted soil. So there's maybe a connection between plants that grow that we associate with paddocks, because where you have animals standing around a lot, sort of unnaturally, they overcompress the soil, and then the plants that germinate, the weeds that germinate in response to that, are ones with big, deep tap roots that help uncompact the soil. So again, thinking about self-regulating function of soil and how different elements, different plants can actually help maintain soil quality and difference and so forth. Anyway, an aside, but just thinking about that. So there's thoughtful, strategic placement of elements to support a function. It's permaculture. That's how we would describe that. So here's a happy horse getting good nutrition, and it's also not bored, and they'll eat every leaf, and then they'll peel all the bark off with their teeth. Be totally kept busy for hours, and it's getting that nutrition. It's also processing the surplus from the farm and turning it into energizing the horse, giving us manure, multiple functions, all happening, local and natural resources, producing no waste. Lovely closed loop permaculture kind of thinking. What you're then left with is lots of sticks that have been very carefully peeled or, chomped at by the grazer browsers. And Chris wondered what to do with them. And it seemed to make sense to put a string in the middle so he could pick them up. And they happen to be this long because that's kind of about the size that they're useful to, you can carry them and move them around. Getting longer, they get a bit unruly. And also, when you're working with narrow diameter sticks, look, they're very easy to cut and move around, aren't they? You don't need a chainsaw. You could do that with loppers and pruners or a little bow saw. That's pretty handy. Chris thought about it, so it was interesting. So he tied it with a string in the middle, and then he picked it up, put it on his shoulder, and they still all sort of went like that, higgledy-piggledy. So he then tied two more strings, sort of, and a third. So there's tied there, and there. There's your bundle of sticks. So Chris kind of thought, this is actually, as a thing, it has kind of the right size, because you could carry a certain size, a certain weight, a certain sort of girth, and when it's tied together, it's like a single element. So he started to think, this is an interesting thing. I wonder if I could do something interesting with it. And I don't know exactly how the whole story worked, but this stream that comes down here, goes through a wetland down the bottom of his land. He started to have thoughts about to create some kind of a way to cross it. So here's the stream, this sort of wetland stream passing through. It's very boggy, very kind of, but there's a flow of water. When it rains a lot, you can see a flow. Other times it's just a kind of, an ooze, shall we say. And look, here are his bundles of sticks laid across the flow of the river and of the stream. And what he realized as he was doing this was he was kind of creating a causeway that gave him access to the wetland. He could actually he couldn't get across there before now without getting all his, his feet wet. And so it made it more accessible. He thought it was interesting. He was excavating the foundation of his house. He was converting a barn there, which was going to ultimately be his domicile. He was living in a caravan for that. And in the process of doing that, released a lot of subsoil. So he started playing, and he's quite a creative guy, and he started playing with these ideas. And now, I don't know how the order of this all works, but I'm going to tell a little side story, and it's this. Chris has an encyclopedia. Do you remember encyclopedias? Before we had Wikipedia, we used to have a shelf full of books that was, the width of a room or something. And they used to sell them in the Encyclopedia Britannica or something. You pay a subscription once a month for about 4 years or something to buy it. But that was your internet, that was your source of information. Well, Chris's granddad had an encyclopedia, and he used to love to go and read it when he was a kid and went to visit his granddad. He'd always be up there in the attic or wherever it was, lost in this book. So eventually when years later, Chris is grown up, granddad passes away, and the encyclopedia comes to Chris. And so he's still rediscovering it again as an adult and rereading it in places, and getting onto lines of inquiry about older ways of doing agriculturally land management things, because that's very much in his interest. Oh, I forgot to say. Obviously, it comes from his granddad, so it was old. And Chris said, I don't know how old the encyclopedia is, but what I do know is on the chapter of Napoleon, he's not dead yet. So I thought that was maybe the chuckle. I like that. So it's like a contemporary to Napoleon. Anyway, he in there found, I don't know exactly how his line of inquiry took him there, but he found a definition for a fascine. And a fascine is a bundle of sticks about that long, tied with 3 pieces of string. And so he realized he hadn't kind of invented anything. He just rediscovered something that's just kind of logical. Something, you know, a bundle of sticks you can carry on your shoulder that you might use. You might dry it out and cut it into faggots and bundles that you would burn on for cooking on, or for a fast, hot, bright flame. That was a unit of energy that was used, you know, in the pre-coal days. But also, I think from the encyclopedia, Chris also got information about the idea of a fascine causeway. And as he was constructing his house, he started throwing the rubble, the subsoil, not the topsoil, but the subsoil that he didn't need, on top of the sticks. And then as that sort of all got worked in, he could put more bundles of sticks, more fascines. He even just started bundling up his prunings, blackcurrants and gooseberries and things, and throwing them on top of it as well, and more soil. And interestingly, some of them started to root. The willows, the blackcurrants and things started to root, and within the topsoil that he was throwing onto it. So slowly the thing becomes like a living porous dam, a leaky dam. He realized he'd kind of recreated this by, you know, but more by design, reinforced by this idea, and really in a similar way to the beavers. So that's what he's made it out of, that and subsoil, and this is it. This is the dam now. This is where its grasses have got established. We've got flag iris, bog myrtle, bog bean, all sorts of different wetland plants. He said, every time the water level rises to the top, you can see whether it's flat or not. And you just throw a bit more material down on the lowest point, throw more bundles of sticks. So water always finds its level. So actually, as you work with the water course, you can slowly keep your dam level and keep raising it. He reckoned, he said one of the horses actually went into this bit. It fell, it jumped in somehow or got frightened or something. And it went in right up to its, I don't know what you call it, its haunches, I guess. So almost 2 meters, he was saying. He reckons he's raised his water table by a couple of meters. And the other thing, of course, is the water, even when they have a heavy rain event, a big flood, the rivers you see often run brown with mud, like we talked about earlier. He said the water coming through his leaky dam is clean like spring water. So he's stabilizing the landscape, he's raising the water table, but he's also cleaning and purifying water. So all these things I'm kind of been saying about how water coming in a stream is aerated, goes through silt beds and sand beds and being filtered, is I'm trying to make a link there to reed beds, and we'll talk about those later, but you can use these very constructed wetland systems, very carefully constructed wetland systems, to clean and re-energize water. And we can do that with natural processes that learn all the lessons from what we've been talking about here. So I'll talk about that later, but just to kind of make that link. Is that it? Oh, that's it. There we go. End of the story. Fascine causeway. So one of the things he again also started to think about is, how do you think that ancient people built their hill forts and they built their big, you know, earthworks and constructions? And of course, now the realization is, in this kind of way, there would have been a lot of coppicing going on. There would have been a lot of growing of narrow diameter sticks. You tie them into bundles. You throw them into piles. you put earth on top of it, then you drive your cattle over top, or you march your army or whatever it is that you've got to pack it all down, compress it. And as soon as you start compressing earth, the clay particles that are in it will start to stick the bigger particles together, and it starts to become more and more cohesive. And in the same way they used to put horsehair in lime plaster on walls to give it structure to hold it together, but effectively that's what the sticks are doing when you're compressing them into the clay and stuff that you're layering onto the that you're adding. So there you go, thinking about fascine causeways, thinking about how we can use very simple techniques that might combine together to trap and slow the flow of water, to clean it, energize it, and to create a head of water above the settlement where it can slowly filter down and be useful for nourishing growing systems, human systems, and obviously biological natural systems. So there's our presentation. I'm going to stop the recording.